Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to start by giving you a quick update on what the EFI Theory Working Group has been doing. Then I'll tell you about some forecasting theory that I recently developed with Michael Cortez and Ethan White. The goal of the EFI Theory Group is to learn when, where, why, and how nature is predictable. We expect that some ecological processes are easier to forecast than others. We want to identify those cases, but we also want to understand why forecasting is easier in some systems than in others. Answering this question will help focus applications on the most tractable problems, but it will also advance basic ecological research by benchmarking our current understanding and motivating novel comparisons across subdisciplines. So how do we do it? One approach is to compare many different forecasts from different systems. This is an inductive or bottom-up approach. This is where our working group started, and we quickly got into the specifics of how to compare different forecasts. What kind of data and metadata would we need? The Forecasting Standards Group is now pushing forward on this front, and I'm not going to talk about it more today. A second approach is deductive. Given our current ecological understanding, can we develop a priori hypotheses about when and where nature is more or less predictable? It turns out that this is not so easy. I wish I could just show you a list of the hypotheses we've developed. Instead, I'm going to describe 3 lessons that we've learned that are helping us move closer to system-specific hypotheses. The first lesson is that a common vocabulary is critical. Forecasts can vary in spatial, temporal, and phylogenetic scale, and making comparisons is virtually impossible without being very explicit about these scales. One dimension of temporal scale is the length of the period being forecasted. This led us to discussions about the difference between the forecast horizon and forecast limit. We've also spent time parsing the difference between predictability and model transferability, and we still haven't agreed on a crisp definition. The clear importance of scale led us to a second lesson, that sources of uncertainty probably depend on scale. So here I'm showing a figure based on Mike Dietz's 2017 paper in Ecological Applications. It makes 2 key points. First, to compare predictability across systems, we should focus on the rate at which uncertainty or forecast error increases as we move away from initial conditions. Second, this rate depends on sources of uncertainty, such as initial conditions, exogenous drivers, parameter uncertainty, parameter variability, and process error. This x-axis implies something about scale. Inspired by our vocabulary debates, Christy Rawlinson thought that we should make those scales explicit. So here we're showing which drivers of uncertainty will dominate at different forecast horizons on the x-axis and spatial scales on the y-axis. We expect that initial conditions dominate short-term dynamics across scales, and this influence may last longer at large scales where endogenous stability is stronger. For long forecasts, uncertainty is dominated by exogenous drivers like climate or land use. Most of the forecast uncertainty is dominated by process uncertainty, which reflects parameter uncertainty as well as heterogeneity and random effects. A third lesson is that successful forecasting requires considering how the scale of the forecast relates to the scale of key ecological processes. For example, if we want to predict population dynamics over short forecast horizons, we clearly need a model that accounts for the influence of weather on birth and death processes. But if we want to predict population dynamics over much longer timescales, we may also need to account for slower processes, ecological and evolutionary selection, or turnover of other species in the community. The implication is that we may need quite different modeling approaches for different forecast horizons. And this is where I'm going to transition from the EFI working group update to my study with Michael and Ethan, which was motivated by this question. We actually had in mind 2 very common phenomenological approaches to ecological forecasting that we think capture processes operating on different scales. The first one is what we call the time series approach. So here we have time series data from one location on both an ecological response, in this case primary production, and an environmental driver, in this case precipitation. We can then plot primary production against annual precipitation. As in most water-limited systems, we see higher production in wetter years. And these numbered circles are just showing you how we map from time series to the bivariate relationship. The second approach is what we call space for time substitution. Here we have data on time average production from many different sites across a region. We can then plot mean production at each site against mean annual precipitation at each site. Again, we typically find that production is higher in wetter sites. Now, even though both approaches model production as a function of precipitation, they may not make the same predictions about how a future change in precipitation will alter production. And that's because these relationships often have different slopes. So here's a classic paper from 1992 comparing a time series model, this one here, and a space for time model, we call it the spatial model, which is this one here. The time series is fit to data from the shortgrass steppe, which is on the western edge of the Great Plains, and the spatial model is fit using data from sites along a west-to-east transect all the way across the plains. Now, if you ask these models how an increase in precipitation will alter production at the shortgrass steppe site, you will get different answers. The time series model would predict a modest increase, while the spatial or space for time model would predict a much larger increase. Now, this difference makes sense because these approaches and these data sets that they're based on are capturing different processes. At any site, like the shortgrass steppe, even though precipitation may differ a lot from one year to the next, the community will be more or less the same. Yes, some species might increase a little and others decrease, but those changes should be relatively small. Furthermore, the soil structure will be the same, land use will probably be also. In contrast, the spatial relationship is showing differences between sites that differ dramatically in composition. Here we're going from shortgrass steppe all the way to tallgrass prairie. Those differences in composition took centuries, perhaps even millennia, to emerge. And not only does the community differ, but soils and land use may also differ quite a bit. So the two approaches reflect processes operating on different timescales. Long-term data from a single site and time series models should capture the fast processes, but few time series are long enough to really capture the slower processes. On the other hand, spatial data and space for time models can capture those slower processes and might make better predictions for very long forecast timescales. Now, what we do with these intermediate timescales is a real challenge. The goal of our study was to explore these three hypotheses. We thought that at short timescales, time series models might perform best. At long forecast timescales, space for time models might perform best. And at intermediate timescales, we wondered if we could combine the time series and space for time approach to make better predictions. Now, we would have loved to test these hypotheses with empirical data, but we couldn't find a data set with a spatial and temporal component, as well as a strong signal of environmental change. Since we couldn't find real data, we decided to make up our own. The idea was to simulate a realistic ecological process, sample the resulting dynamics as if we were field ecologists, then try to predict the impact of an environmental change using time series and space for time models. So here's our approach in a little more detail. Again, we start with this mechanistic simulation model. We use that model to simulate a baseline period with a stationary temperature. We then impose a period of warming followed by another period of stationary but elevated temperature. Now, using just the data from the baseline period, we fit a time series model and a space for time model. We then use those models to predict what we think will happen given information about mean temperature in the future, this part. And in addition to the forecast from the time series and space for time models, we also consider a combined forecast, which is just a weighted average of the two, but where the weights can change over time. Now, before I go farther, let me explain why we don't simply try to forecast with a mechanistic or process-based model that would, in principle, work well at any scale. For now, I'm just going to say that we don't think a fully process-based model is feasible. And furthermore, a model that represents lots and lots of processes might not actually improve prediction. And that's because it would likely contain significant parameter error. So I am convinced that time series and space for time approaches will continue to have an important role to play in forecasting. But thinking carefully about process might help us to use these phenomenological approaches more effectively. So now I'll go ahead and I'll describe this simulation model we used. It is a meta-community model developed by Jake Alexander and colleagues, published in Global Change Biology in 2018. The model represents a meta-community composed of sites arrayed along a linear elevation and temperature gradient. Sites are colonized by species drawn from a randomly generated regional species pool. And this species pool assumes a trade-off between rapid growth and high competitive ability on one hand, and slow growth and cold tolerance on the other hand. So we expect that warm sites will be dominated by the fast-growing species and cold sites dominated by the cold-tolerant species. Competition is Lotka Volterra, but intraspecific competition is forced to be stronger than intraspecific competition, so coexistence of multiple species within each site is possible. And the last thing is that these sites are linked via dispersal. When we simulate the model, it generates classic Whittaker curves, shown here. Different colors are the different species, and the colors also indicate the cold tolerance growth rate trade-off. So the dark blue or purple species that's dominant at this end of the gradient is cold tolerant but grows slowly. The red species over here grows quickly but it's not cold tolerant. For our forecasting exercise, we focused on the biomass of the species dominant at the site in the middle of the gradient, and that's the dark blue species here. The dashed line shows our space for time model. It's just a simple quadratic regression. And here I'm showing year-to-year variation in the biomass of the focal species at that focal site. You can see that biomass is a little bit higher in warmer years than in colder years. And the dashed line here shows our time series model. Biomass depends on biomass the year before and a linear effect of temperature. So now let's look at the temporal dynamics and the forecast. So again, the top panel just shows the pattern of temperature change. Gray is actual annual temperature. It varies from year to year. And black is the mean temperature. And we generate the forecast by assuming that we know the future mean temperature perfectly, even though we don't know the annual temperatures. The bottom panels show the simulated biomass of the focal species in gray. The vertical dashed line marks the start of the temperature increase and also the start of our forecast period. You can see that the time series forecast, which is shown in blue, does quite well at first, capturing this initial increase in the abundance of our focal species, but then it becomes far too optimistic. In contrast, the space for time model does quite poorly at first, but by the end of the situation, it matches the observed biomass pretty well. It's fallen below its initial baseline level. Now, before I talk about the weighted forecast in purple, let me show you what is driving this initial increase and then decrease in the simulated biomass. So the third panel shows the focal species in black and all other species in gray. As the warming begins, the biomass of the focal species increases because in this model, all species grow faster in warmer temperatures. However, over time, the less cold tolerant species begin to increase in abundance even more. Furthermore, colonization of new species fuels this trend, makes it even stronger. So as the biomass of faster growing competitors increases, the biomass of our focal species declines. Okay, so what about the weighted forecast, this purple line? It looks so accurate. Well, it's just a weighted average of the time series and the space for time models. The blue line in this panel shows how the weight given to the time series model changes over time. So initially, all the weight is given to the time series model. As the biomass of the focal species decreases and those competitor species increases, that's the period of rapid change in model weights. And by the end of the forecast period, we're giving almost all the weight to the forecast from the spatial model, the space for time model. Now, the reason that this weighted forecast looks so good is that it's not really a forecast. To find the weights, we cheated. We just fit the weights to the simulated data, to this gray line. We chose weights that would optimize the performance of this combined forecast. To make this a real forecast, we would need to determine those weights ahead of time. We'd have to predict the weights. Well, we currently have no idea how to do that. And that brings me to the key question. What is it that determines this shift in model weights? Or how quickly do slow processes like community turnover that are captured in the space for time approach begin to affect dynamics? Well, we can change model parameters to see how the rate at which those weights shift changes. So here I'm showing that higher dispersal rates in lighter grays lead to a faster shift in the weights. And that makes good intuitive sense. But there are lots of other factors which also might come into play. The strength of competition, the amount of environmental variability, the list goes on and on. Now I see answering this question as a really important challenge for future research. In fact, that is the main lesson I learned from our simulation study, that this question is interesting and consequential. I think that answering it will require novel collaboration among theorists, paleoecologists, experimentalists, and researchers working with long-term data sets, as well as modelers. Now, if you have any interest in exploring ideas like these, in developing or testing theory for ecological forecasting, then please join the EFI community and the theory working group. There's still many opportunities to contribute. Thank you for listening.